Picture it for a second. A wooden horse, 40-some feet of hollow belly on wheels, rolled through the gates of a city by the very people it's about to destroy. Soldiers packed in, shoulder to shoulder in the dark, listening to their own footsteps, get dragged closer to the enemy camp. It's the single most famous image to come out of the ancient world. Statues of it, movies about it, an entire English idiom built on it. And here's the part that should stop you cold. Homer never wrote a word of that scene. Not the soldiers curled up in the belly. Not the fake retreat. Not the ambush in the dark. None of it. The poem that supposedly invented the most famous trick in military history mentions the horse exactly twice, in 2 lines total, and then moves on like it barely happened. So if Homer barely wrote it, where did the horse everyone knows actually come from? And more to the point, was there ever a horse at all? Here's the detail that should bother you first. The Iliad, the poem about the Trojan War itself, doesn't mention the horse even once. It ends before the war does. The Odyssey only brings it up in passing. 2 lines, no wheels, no ambush, no drama. The horse you're picturing right now, hollow belly, soldiers stacked inside, the whole city hauling their own destruction through the gates by hand, comes almost entirely from the Aeneid, a Roman epic written by Virgil centuries after Homer was dead. Somewhere out there, a Roman poet is currently getting full, uncredited in your brain until now, royalties on your favorite plot twist. Which means the actual question isn't, did the horse happen the way Virgil describes it? It's, what real thing was Virgil describing in the first place? And historians have spent 2,000 years arguing over 4 different answers. The first comes from a Greek writer named Pausanias, working in the 2nd century AD, who found the whole wooden horse premise, frankly, a little insulting to the Trojans' intelligence. His writing on it drips with sarcasm, essentially asking his readers to believe an entire city fell for a children's toy. His actual theory, it wasn't a horse at all, it was a battering ram. Ancient siege rams really were sometimes wrapped in horsehide, both to muffle the sound of the swing and to resist fire arrows, and doused in water for the same reason. Armies nicknaming their hardware after animals isn't even unusual. A modern army does the same thing every time it rolls out a helicopter called the Black Hawk or the Raven. It's a genuinely tidy theory, with one obvious hole in it. It's hard to hide a company of armed men inside a solid battering ram, which is a fairly significant problem for a story that hinges entirely on men hiding inside it. Theory 2 is stranger and comes from an Austrian historian named Fritz Schachermayer. The horse wasn't a machine at all. It was a metaphor for an earthquake. Poseidon is the god of both horses and earthquakes, and archaeological digs at Troy really do show wall damage consistent with seismic activity, not just siege warfare. It's a genuinely elegant idea, right up until you remember that Poseidon is the same god credited in the myths themselves with having built Troy's walls in the first place, which makes him a strange choice to cast as the one knocking them back down. Most historians pass on this one for exactly that reason. Now you might be thinking, maybe none of this needs an explanation at all. Maybe it's just a story, the same way Icarus's wax wings are just a story, with no real object hiding underneath it, no ancient engineers standing behind the curtain going, well, technically. That's a Sometimes a myth is just a myth, and the person looking for a real Trojan horse is doing the historical equivalent of asking what the real Batcave was. But here's where it gets stranger, and where the strongest theory actually lands. Ancient Greeks had a habit of calling ships seahorses, and it wasn't just slang. Homer himself uses exactly that word for ships elsewhere in the Odyssey, in the same breath he'll later use for the thing waiting outside Troy's gates. Look closely at the language describing soldiers climbing into the horse. and it mirrors, almost word for word, the language Homer uses elsewhere for soldiers boarding a ship. The same verbs for loading in, the same posture, the same crowding. Zoom out on the whole shape of the story, and there's a symmetry too clean to be an accident. The Trojan War opens with the building of 1,000 ships to sail to Troy, and it closes with the building of one more horse to end it. And this isn't just a coincidence of vocabulary. Ancient sailors were already, quite literally, sailing around in wooden horses centuries before the war supposedly ended. Put it together, and the most literarily and archaeologically consistent answer turns out to be the least dramatic one. The horse that ended Troy was very possibly a ship, mistranslated by nothing stranger than 400 years of an oral tradition that liked its metaphors a little too much. Zoom out even further, and a pattern starts to show up that should feel familiar by now. A siege engine wrapped in hide, a ship nicknamed after an animal, an earthquake blamed on a god who moonlights in both categories. None of these are lies, and none of them were dreamed up out of nothing. They're what happens to a real unglamorous piece of military hardware after it survives 400 years with nobody around to write it down. The boring technical details, the hide wrapping, the shipbuilding vocabulary, the actual tactics, erode away first because nobody bothers to memorize the boring part. What's left standing after 4 centuries of retelling is whichever image was strange enough to be worth repeating around a fire, and by the time a Roman poet centuries later goes looking for a dramatic centerpiece to close out his own version of the war, all that survives is a name: horse. So he builds one. Wheels, hollow belly, soldiers stacked inside, and all. And it works so well as a story that it quietly buries the far less cinematic truth underneath it, which is, frankly, a little insulting to whatever engineer actually built the thing. So, the next time you picture the horse, towering, hollow, rolled in through gates that should never have opened, try picturing instead a battered ram wrapped in stinking hide, or a low black warship with a carved wooden head cutting through dark water toward a burning city. Less cinematic, sure, but it's the version that actual soldiers probably built with actual tools, instead of the one 400 years of campfires eventually settled on. The horse was never made of wood. It was made of people trying to describe something they didn't have the right words for, until the wrong word was the only one left standing.